There's something to be said about reviewing a book. It's an arduous process, but it's not the end of the world if the book you're reviewing turns out to be an enormous disappointment. Good bloody grief. Oh no, you're not getting away from your review that easily. Back in March, I started reading Forged Within Flame. Even before then, I had intended to use it to discuss a specific community of Ruby critics that its author, Raymond McNeil, incidentally happened to be a part of. Unfortunately, I decided to drop the idea of talking about Ruby critics because I grew to despise a good majority of them, especially the floof artist. The floof artist was responsible for sending anti-trans harassers after one of my friends, when all said friend wanted to do was help Floof not be an ignorant douchebag. He was, and still is now, officially as much of a fucking hypocrite as Barbara Dunkleman, if not more. For months, I had been conflicted on whether or not to follow through with this review. I remembered promising to make it when I first started, but then, after getting about halfway through the whole thing, I completely checked out of it mentally. There was a car crash scene involving a protagonist texting someone else, which made absolutely no sense in context to the short story the crash happened in. I was actually relieved that I finished this book 2 months later, but because I mentally checked out during the halfway point, I felt it was not worth it just to say the book was bad. I still finished all the way through, entirely because I have a disposition towards completionism. I was hopeful about Forged Within Flame for a number of reasons. The first one was, if this book had been good, I could have said it was a solid example of a fandom's critics having writing on par with, or even superior to, the work being criticized by the critics. The second one was potentially seeing Forged Within Flame as a gateway to expanding my extremely narrow set of interests to include more things I'm interested in, period. Okay, so first of all, the preface is whack. Darkness. I'm getting to it. Just, hold on, let me find the quotes. First and foremost, the stories beyond this page contain sexual content involving what most readers in the West would consider minors. This story is set in Japan, which, as to this author's understanding, has more complicated consent laws than those here in the States. On a technical level, the national age of consent there is 13 years of age, which may seem appalling to most Western sensibilities, but I assure you, there is more to the laws than that singular number. This is straight up wrong. There are 3 sexual consent laws of importance, which aren't nearly as complicated as they're cracked up to be. There's the Gokanzai, or penal law regarding sexual assault, which protects people under 13 years of age from sexual assault. Then, there's the Inko-jyore, or the Juvenile Obscene Act, which protects minors from unethical relationships and protects individuals who are under the age of 18. Then there are Minpo, or civil codes, which define everyone under 20 years old as juvenile and protects the rights of parents and their families. Gobiano extrapolates, with better wording than I could have ever imagined, to explain why saying, the national age of consent in Japan is 13 years old, is a blatant falsehood. Western works that feature Japan, when done right, tend to show that they know what they're talking about. They show this knowledge by being pointedly specific as to what aspects of Japan are being discussed in their work. It would not have taken a whole lot of effort to specify what consent laws were looked over. I had to sacrifice part of my time to the Google overlords to make sure I understood what McNeil meant in his preface, and I want that time back, damn it! When I decided to sit down and begin penning this collection, my goal was to explore a group of characters growing up and learning how to continue living in the face of life's more uncomfortable hardships. In my experience, most stories centered around similar premises end up glossing over the latent sexuality of the human condition, a condition that comes into play far earlier in a person's life than most adults are comfortable admitting. It's the gap in observance that I wanted to explore, and how critical those moments are in defining a person's life once they escape the orbit of their teenaged years. Darkness. Yes, I know teenaged isn't a word. You don't have to remind me. This quote is otherwise a value claim about how most edgy stories don't include enough people diddling each other. At least, that's how I'm choosing to parse it. Has he never watched a John Hughes movie? More importantly, what media has he consumed, and what extent has he consumed it to come to this conclusion? I can hazard a guess from skimming his YouTube channel, Celtic Phoenix Productions. Beyond this, I would have largely no idea as to the extent of his writing journey, with me only being able to make semi-educated estimates otherwise. But on more pleasant topics, there is something to be said about the format of this book. You'll notice that it's a collection of short stories and not a novel, novella, or any variation thereof. Each story was written and intended to be an individual piece unreliant of any previous or subsequent work, and theoretically speaking should be readable and understandable in any given order, barring the installments that required two parts to function properly. Unreliant is not a word, though I'm confused by this more so than by how McNeil's short stories collection doesn't already resemble a novel. He formatted his work so that it was split into two sections, Fireworks and Wildfire. Though he claimed his short stories could be read in any order, the Fireworks stories were already something that had a linear, start-to-finish order. This order could be confirmed through the way each short story was chronologically organized, by time period. Arguably, this was also true of Wildfire, though it's basically a glorified epilogue with multiple parts that could be interchangeable with themselves. The short stories within both are also closely linked to each other in continuity, such that you can't really ignore any of them. I really wanted to skip a bunch of it just to follow the perspective of the only character I found to be affable. However, to do that, I would have to willfully disregard a solid chunk of this pile of junk. I schemed for a while to convey my immense displeasure in Forged Within Flame through a number of arguments. There are 6 girls which encompass the main protagonist roles Forged Within Flame has to offer. The problem with them is they are not people. They are plot devices and tropes played straight to the point of absolute, irrefutable, maddening tedium. They all have names: Mahiru, Makoto, Sumika, Yukima, Soraka, and Satsuki. However, these names sound too close to each other, and I have gotten one person confused for another as a result. I actively wanted to rename the characters so I would not keep forgetting who was who throughout the entirety of Forged Within Flame, but chose not to because coming up with wacky nicknames which only made sense to me would have been confusing to everyone else, and was therefore impractical. Forged Within Flame advertised 6 main protagonists, but the reality was most of the short stories were written with only one of them in mind, Mahiru. She was the only one who really got a lot of action centered around her from start to finish. Most of the other characters functionally orbited around Mahiru to an extent akin to satellites. For instance, Makoto was a childhood ex-lover who left Mahiru. They broke up because the redhead's father, a heretical Christian priest, attacked the rest of her family. In this backstory process, Makoto went down a mostly off-screen pipeline which resulted in her becoming a Kyoko Sakura clone. In an attempt to get over Makoto, Mahiru befriended a bunch of girls in the setting of Fusayumi, whose name was only memorable because it encompassed punctuation errors around the proper noun nearly every time it showed up on screen. These girls were Soraka, Fumine, Yumika, and Tsukima, Yukima and Sumika. Sorry. Yukima then disappeared on a flight to Germany. The plane crashed with no survivors in the middle of Iraq, with Yukima as the sole survivor, actually. This was the only setting change at all, with the main incentive being the involvement of a character metamorphosis. Too bad for Yukima, as this metamorphosis was half-assed to the point of being primarily told rather than shown. With Yukima gone, the person she formed a those two guys dynamic with, Sumika, attempted to date Mahiru because they shared tragic experiences. I would define Sumika as a satellite character, as her lack of personality or individual character traits was at the forefront of my mind the moment she wasn't with somebody else. Likewise, I would go the extra kilometer to say Sumika is an even worse trope, satellite love interest, as her only role in the short stories was to be paired off with someone else. Soraka had a best friend who was big into theater named Tokubei, though I personally think he should have been named Warwick, as someone who knows Soraka is a name obviously derived from League of Legends. Soraka's friend Fumine threatened to meddle and take Tokubei for herself if Soraka didn't act on her feelings for him within 3 days, which caused problems related to the timing of each person's would-be confessions. The timing was after he had to be hospitalized for an accident. Not only was Fumine a bad friend, she deliberately orchestrated for Soraka's attempt to fail, as it naturally did. Soraka got into a drunken bender after the fact, which resulted in her trying to put the moves on Sumika and Mahiru both. This caused the latter to suggest they form a polyromantic family, where they could all be there for each other. The formation of this polyromantic family was honestly when the book peaked, and the narrative highly suggested success. Then, the aforementioned random car crash happened, and the writing as of it just careened into a downward spiral and ruined everything. It ruined everything by dissolving the polyromantic relationship based off the most asinine of reasons. Wildfire tried validating the disillusion by later promising a future one between people related to the 6 protagonists. If nothing else, the other relationship was implied to be successful, though it was essentially glossed over through bad exposition before being made into a sequel hook. Given I was already baited the first time, I would still hold my doubts on any relationship written by McNeil being handled with care or grace. None of the other relationships were good, and pretending otherwise is willful delusion. I had plans involving the exaltation of Lily Orchard's videos, most notably one titled Not Good Enough. I would quote the videos when referring to the endgame relationships written in Forged Within Flame, because my grumblings about the relationships, grumble, would be based on the generally foul mistreatment oft given to LGBT characters across mainstream media. Making a young adult short stories collection about sapphic girls being made miserable for the wrong reasons was in disgusting taste to begin with. So I was unsure of what I was actually expecting by the end of Wildfire. The last of the 6 girls, Satsuki, only existed to be paired off with Mahiru. She was given a smidgen of background info about her, but was pretty much rendered to being a miniature version of the other girl. This reminded me of Voltron Legendary Defender, which was only refreshing because of how much this short stories collection loved to lift, specifically from Puella Madoka Magica wholesale. Otherwise, making a character just to be a satellite love interest would be considered bad writing, no matter how one sliced it. Makoto was also brought back, just to be paired with Soraka. This would have been fine had she developed an actual personality to bounce off Soraka with. The problem was they essentially became watered-down versions of Kyoko Sakura and Sayaka Miki, respectively. For a spell, I believed their relationship was meant to criticize Puella Madoka Magica for being boring. My belief in Forged Within Flame doing actual criticism of bad magical girl anime did not last, because no deconstruction was actually accomplished by the circular storylines where each of the girls partook in. Rather, it chose to keep the characters exactly the same as they were when they met each other, without spending any effort to make them stop being clones. The last relationship was Yukima and Sumika. Hopefully I said that right. Of the three endgame pairings, this one actually tried to give the characters chemistry with each other. The problem here was Sumika treating herself like a martyr for being well-adjusted, while Yukima's trauma proved to be an obstacle to reintegrating her into the peaceful Fusayumi. This perception of herself initially led to the interactions being toxic, but ultimately nothing was challenged in the end. The relationship itself would be tantamount to a slow burn relationship, of which was cruelly unfortunate because that seemed to be all most LGBT relationships would ever amount to in stories of equal terribleness. And there are a lot of equally terrible stories. I would have compared the relationships to each one covered by Lily Orchard's Not Good Enough video, with intent on explaining why Raymond McNeil's characters and their relationships also fit the bill of not good enough in my eyes. There's not much else I would have said which wasn't a plea to escape talking about Forged Within Flame and trying to talk about topics of actual interest to me instead. I would have fallen face first into a tangent about how phenomenally agreeable Lily Orchard's videos were, with me needing to firmly ground myself in reality once I remembered Tropes vs. Sheldon Cooper existed. I at minimum partially disagreed with that specific video's talking points, amid other ones not relevant to my current video essay's thesis of Forged Within Flame is heinously awful, here's why. I also had not, at least as of this video's release date, read anything Lily made herself which wasn't a video essay, so I could not immediately declare Lily's writing to be infinitely superior to Raymond's without embarrassing myself. I prefer having a vast amount of knowledge on what I'm talking about, which I like to think I do, because otherwise my usefulness to everyone and everything has long since been outlived by 7 years and 2 months. The tangents I would have gone on also would have served to commit a particularly nasty sin Forged Within Flame is without a shadow of a doubt guilty of. Padding. There are paragraphs and even whole short stories which do and say absolutely nothing in so many words, with the transparent motive being to reach a high word or page count. If it is not done out of a want to reach a threshold of some kind, then my next guess is the padding results from being consistently wrong-headed about what makes good dialogue or good character traits. Regardless, the padding in this book aggravated me to where I had to put it down and take deep breaths to avoid popping a blood vessel. This artificially extended the time I exerted to consume this book, and I still feel nausea from remembering it. Reading Forged Within Flame was an act of self-harm. After the random car crash, there was a 0% chance of me liking anything within the short stories collection, yet I read along anyway. I have engaged in equivalent acts of self-harm in the past by deliberately consuming media I knew I would despise with every fiber of my being, such as Rick and Morty and post-Volume 3 Ruby. Friends of mine criticized this behavior before, and I am certain they will shake their heads in dismay at the fact I have once again failed to adhere to their advice while making a steadfast effort to examine works that are not Ruby or Rick and Morty. This failure is a burdensome weight tugging at my heart when trying to do this review, and part of the reason why I delayed it so much was to see if I could make the internal pain stop. I considered this complete cowardice and chose to keep moving forward. I wasted time and money on Forged Within Flame, which could have been spent elsewhere without damaging myself in the process. Forged Within Flame was wrong about Japan's age of consent, The text's main mission statement was to portray young girls being made miserable through circumstances almost entirely beyond their control, and it actively chose to borrow so much from Puella Madoka Magica it bordered on plagiarism. I did not think a Ruby critic's work would become the worst literature I would ever consume. I was wrong. And I've been wrong for months.